All right.
Okay, hi guys. We're gonna start lecture. Unfortunately, I don't know how to fix this, so I can't find a remote. So we're just gonna have to scroll through like we did last time. I sent everybody the lecture slides, so sorry about that. I'll really try to like email someone about this for next week. But yeah, thanks for coming. It's week 3. We're working with components and other tools this week, and yeah. So here's the attendance. Feel free to like save it for now and then we'll come back. I'll give you guys the word at the end of lecture. So yeah, components, reusable element systems that you use throughout your designs. So what are components? Components are elements that you can create that are reusable across your whole project. You can make a component out of anything in your project, shapes, icons, images, text, and so on. And components are good for grouping things together into categories and maintaining consistent designs over your project. So the four squares that make a diamond, that is the button that you press to make a component within your files. And it's located in your design bar at the very top. But we'll look more into that. So how do components work? The main component defines the properties of a component, and then some of these properties include shapes, size, colors, location of text box, and so on. And the shortcut is you can select the layers you want and click the component button. Click the drop down if you want to make multiple layers into multiple components. And then Alt Option plus Command and Control plus K also works as a shortcut to automatically make something a component for you. And an instance is like a copy of the main component, and this can be reused throughout your design. They're linked to the main component, so any change that you make to the main will be reflected in the instance. But you can also individually change instances by overriding them. And this is all in the Assets panel. So all of a file's components can be viewed in the Assets panel located on the left-hand side of the screen. So remember we were talking about how all of your layers are stored in the file. Next to that, there's another menu, which is the assets. And in here, you can search up any component that you've ever made. And it's a shortcut to being able to add it to your screens, to your files, I mean. And a file's components can also be accessed through the keyboard shortcut of Shift-I. And this opens a modal where you can search for filter and use all sorts of assets. So you can even find assets that aren't within your own file. And a lot of Figma users make components and make assets for everybody to use. So that's also another place where you can find and access things that others have designed that will make it easier for your designs. So you don't have to like recreate whole things. Like, for example, a really popular one is like a lot of people when they design, they want to have like an iPhone to visualize their designs, but they don't want to like manually make that. A lot of people have already made that component and you can go access it and find it within your assets library and just reuse it throughout your designs. So next slide, there are two main ways in which components can be used. So you can create a main component and then use its non-overridden instances throughout the design. And then if you want to make changes to the component, all the instances would automatically update to match the main. So an example of this is icons within your design, stages of a progress bar, buttons with set text and styles, next, continue, cancel. So if you look closer at like the progress bar, the not started would be like the main instance, right? And then you're creating more instances that would allow you to select things like in progress, submitted results. But the original is the not started, and then you're able to like override and like edit the other things, the other options so that your design can, you don't have to make the same thing over and over again, right? So to use a component, you create a main component, like I was saying, and then use it as a template. And then when you create instances, you can edit text, colors, and other elements. Shape and size will still remain linked to the main component, making it easy to update the size, fonts, or spacing. So for example, cards, for example, an email card with a subject, sender, preview, and icon, buttons, where text and size will change depending on where it's used, and then text inputs. So in the example on the side, the overridden instance, each card has a specific name and date, even though the original shape and location of the size is over the card is kind of the same. In each one, you can kind of see a little variance, but you get to keep the same structure, right? And there are many ways to use and apply components, from games to character makers to buttons and other UI UX elements. And then all these cool things can be built with the same basic component feature. So from top left clockwise, you can see like the Catan board game pieces, Figma bingo squares, systems of button variants. And these are all just examples of having a main component and then variations of that in one's design so that you can always access things and reuse them as you please. And so that leads into variants. So variants are a way of grouping components that have similar purposes with only minor differences. So it allows you to organize your components and quickly switch between variants of that element in your design. So you can have, for example, many different variants of buttons, but they are all in the family of button. So when you go into button, you can see like red button, green button, orange button, but it's all going to be within one family. And then you can also see all of its variants. So to create variants from components, you rename components with slash naming convention, like family slash property one, family slash property two, and then you can select all and combine as variants using the button in the right sidebar. So adjusting and swapping the variants. Variants properties can be adjusted. You select the variant group, and then in the right sidebar, you can add more properties or edit names. And you can even create properties that use switches by naming the property options on and off or true and false. And then once you've made a group of variants, you can go to the assets in the left bar and drag out an instance of the variant. So in the right sidebar, you can then switch between each variant. Whenever you have created your component, when it's in the assets, and you can see like in the example on the, when you're facing, you're right, sorry. You can see how it'll have a drop-down menu and you can choose exactly which variants of that component you want to include, and it gives you that option. And then component properties are a more advanced way to customize component elements without using variants and are displayed in the design tab. So elements within a component can be customized easily using properties, and you can toggle the visibility of an element, update an element's text, swap instances of elements, for example, like switching the icons, and yeah. So there's three properties. So within, say, your components. So you have text. If you have text layers within a component, that will be customized. You can add a text layer to the component. And then next time you use an instance of that component, the design tab will let you edit the text directly. Boolean is useful when you want to toggle the visibility of a certain element within your component. And then instances of the component will have a toggle button in the design tab that lets you hide or show that element. And then swap instance property is ideal if you have multiple values that you want to swap between. And then you may have buttons with many, many options for icons, and then property lets you easily choose which one. And then variables are reusable definitions, like styles that can be assigned to various design attributes like color, numbers, and strings. However, unlike styles, variables can switch between definitions depending on the theme that is applied. So you can see how like you have light variables and then dark variables all within your design. It's just a really good way to like keep everything organized and accessible. So variable types. When you're creating a variable, you'll see 4 different types available. So color, number, string, Boolean. And then variables can be applied to layers and objects using fields in the right sidebar. And then creating a component plus variants and variables of components. This will be something that you'll walk through more during your labs. But yeah, any questions so far? No? All good? It's kind of hard to visualize till you guys start doing it, but other useful tools is smart selection, grids and guides, and constraints. So smart selection is a way to quickly arrange and rearrange elements. So when you're working with Figma, it's guaranteed that your project will have many layers and elements that you'll need to arrange. And then smart selection helps you do that by letting you select groups of items and then adjusting their ordering or spacing with just a click or a drag. So adjusting spacing, if you have a group of objects you want to arrange and space evenly, you don't have to like drag them manually. You can make sure they're aligned on the X or Y axis and then drag to select them all and click tidy up in the right sidebar. And then from there, you can hover over the selection and drag the handles up or down. And then reordering objects, you can swap the order of objects that have already been aligned and tidied up. You select the objects, hover over the center one that you want to move, and just drag it on the pink circle to the desired final spot. So this is also possible with auto layout, but we'll talk about auto layout later. And then resizing objects. When objects have been tidied up, we can resize multiples of them all at once. And then you select the group of objects, shift and click the smart handle, pink ring of the objects you want to resize, and then resize as normal. Grids and guides. These are two tools that can be used to help you align objects and keep spacing in mind. So guides are lines that you can drag out to where you want that help you align things, and then layout grids help align objects within a frame along a custom grid that's not reliant on a pixel grid. And they provide visual structure and help to keep consistency across platforms. So guides are really helpful when you're marking a line and you want to align objects and then allow objects to snap to that line. And you make sure your rulers are on, which is Shift R is for your rulers. And then to apply a grid, simply drag from either the top or left side ruler to make a horizontal or vertical grid line respectively. And then grids, layout grids, they let you create consistency across your design. These are more like static and they don't really move or like adjust anything in your design, but it's a good way to like work across something. And they make decisions easier when adjusting spacing. They reduce time while making mockups as well as allowing for flexible layouts. You can apply a layout grid to frames only, like top level frames. However, you can also apply them into nested frames. So creating a layout grid, you select the frame you want to apply a grid on. And remember, it has to be a frame. It can't be a shape that you dragged onto your file. And then you could do Control or Command plus Alt Option G. And then in the right sidebar, you click the plus sign to create a layout grid on that frame. So again, it's in your design panel on your left, on your right, and then you just create layout grid. A uniform grid is going to be placed by default, but you can click on the grid icon next to the grid name to adjust grid properties. So you can use as many rows or columns as you'd like. You can even only do rows or only do columns, and you can make a custom grid if you'd like. It all depends on what you need within your design. And then after clicking the grid icon, you have the option to turn the grid into a column or row grid. And you can also add another one and layer different types of grids. And then column and row properties are editable. And spacing, number of rows, columns in the grid, margin, and offset, all these you can change. And then you can make a grid fixed by setting its width, height, and number of rows. Or you can leave it alone and it will adjust automatically if resized. Any questions on that? Nope. And then constraints. So making sure designs always resize the right way. So when we resize an object or an element, often we want to increase the size, but have its contents remain in the same positions. So for example, say a website's logo should always be in the top left corner, but you can see in like the illustration on the side, sometimes the resizing doesn't work in our favor, but we can fix this with constraints. So in the example in the right sidebar, you can adjust the constraints to constrain the photo to the left side of the bar. And then all the constraint options for horizontal axis, for example, you can choose like you want it to always be on the left, regardless of how you're moving the frame around. And then this will resize with the position kept in mind. And then you can also do this for the vertical axis. And then these work the same way as horizontal can be used in any combination. So it really depends on your needs for your design. Any questions? Ideation and wireframing. So what is wireframing and why is it important? So when you're trying to create designs, you might have many different ideas you want to try out with different layouts, fonts, compositions, and flows. And wireframing is a great way to work through all your different ideas and prompt new ones. Also, this is sometimes called prototyping, but not to be confused with prototyping your design, aka adding in interactions in your screen to make the file interactive, will be taught later on. So that'll be a different lecture. But you can experiment with different ideas. So wireframes are basically your design at different stages of the design process. And sometimes these are referred to as the prototypes, but they generally represent the same thing. So prototypes usually have some interactivity. That means you've created a way for a user to move throughout your design. That's prototyping, and we'll talk about that later. But using different fidelity or stages of wireframes with your design allows you to be flexible in arranging and rearranging details and to explore all the ideas that you have. So you can kind of see in the design on the right, the one on the bottom left is like lo-fi, or bottom right is lo-fi, it's lowest fidelity. It's sort of just a sketch, like a hand-drawn sketch of like what your idea is. And then as you're moving along, like to the side and up, you can kind of see how the details have significantly like improved and like become really fleshed out. So that's sort of wireframe. And then what's fidelity? So you can think of fidelity as the level of completeness of the design. So a low fidelity design means starting from the beginning, representing the design with the most basic shapes of objects and position of text, as well as no or few colors. Mid fidelity means more components are in progress with text fleshed out and more details added, such as basic colors. And then high fidelity is close to a final product. Often like the designs that you see in like the apps or the websites that you visit, that is the highest fidelity. And that is like sort of what designers are always working towards. And then most details are brought in and perfected with colors and content in place. So you can see an example on the right, a low mid fidelity wireframe, and then the high fidelity or final version. You can see they added images, they finalized fonts. Um, This is an example of a screen in low, mid, and high fidelity prototypes on the next slide. And then working in lower mid-fi allows you to easily move elements and play around with your design before you're set into a specific designer idea. You'll find that like sometimes it's if you are immediately working on the highest possible level of your design, it'll be really hard to like adjust things or like work backwards when you find an issue. So that's why a lot of designers make sure to like go through the design process of like starting with something super basic and something that isn't set in place so that they can really adjust it and mold it to what they need. And you should include basic structure plus spacing and only key elements within like a lo-fi or mid-fi and focus on the hierarchy and shapes. Mhm.
For the purpose of this class, would lo-fi be like always on Figma or do we like draw it?
Both. It's really up to you. Um, when we like for example, the Spotify exam or for your midterm project, it's gonna ask for like some of the options, it's gonna ask you for like a lo-fi, mid-fi, and a hi-fi version. For that purpose, it might be easier to do it in Figma, but you can always like upload your sketches to show us like what your original idea thinking was, and that's also acceptable. So yeah. The only reason why we would encourage in Figma is so that like what I like to do, for example, is like once I've created like a lo-fi or a mid-fi, I always copy paste that base and then I add to it. So it's kind of more helpful if you, for you, maybe like if you feel like sketching will be more helpful, then do that, of course.
So like how would you differentiate like a low versus mid on a Figma? It's all like, nice shapes. And
Yeah. Well, I would say like lo-fi, I almost like would never put text or like it's really shapes. It's only shapes. It's like where things would be like there is going to be a text box here. I'm only drawing a box. Like maybe within mid-fi, I'd start like writing text and seeing what fonts might work within my design. So adding maybe like color themes or things like that would be like mid-fi. You'll see as you work along, but also sketching is completely acceptable. And you can use that when you submit. And then after lo-fi and mid and hi-fi, you can continue adding in more details like text or varying shapes, adding in basic components and so on. And then basic colors might be useful as well. So like we were saying, the line between mid and hi-fi can be blurry. So just keep in mind that hi-fi is often close to the final design and illustrations, icons, content colors, and type should all be mostly set. Any other questions so far? Yeah, we're gonna wrap up and then we're gonna do a small like demo activity together. So your homework this week, which was actually my favorite assignment when I took the class, is making Spotify. So the homework will now be in the community page, but it's also going to be posted on Canvas. And then for this week's homework, you'll practice using components to make low, mid, and high-fi wireframes. And then the goal of this is sort of like to make you guys comfortable with creating something and like reusing it within your design. So making the components and reusing them across like your low, mid, and hi-fi design. Um, yeah. Any questions about the homework? Feel free to reach out also once you get started or ask your lab instructors. And then lab 3, I'll be talking about pattern grids. And the secret word for attendance is chair. I'm gonna share with you guys, or actually, if everyone could open up Figma, and we're gonna have you guys practice like creating a component and then creating variants of that component. And give me a thumbs up when you're on the Figma design, on a Figma page. Okay,